Paul Smith, who has lost his wife, is shocked to see a young black boy crying at the grave of his wife. He doesn't know what the boy was doing there. What was Barry's secret bond with Rachel, and what story is behind his tears? Let us know where in the world you are watching from below before we start the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this story. Paul Smith walked slowly along Greenville Cemetery's winding path. His worn-out shoes scraped against the ground. The air was cool in the fall, and it smelled like leaves and wood smoke in the distance. Paul pulled the worn-out jacket around his thin body even tighter, and looked straight ahead at the familiar path that lay ahead. The graveyard spread out in front of him. It was a peaceful area with rolling hills and old oak trees. The golden leaves let some sunlight through, and the ground have a mix of shades. Paul thought it was a beautiful place, but he couldn't see it anymore. Paul only saw it as the spot where Rachel was lying. Like every day, Paul's heart felt heavy as he walked up to Rachel's grave. Rachel's name was written in beautiful writing on the polished granite headstone that stood in front of him. Paul didn't want to do it, so he knelt down slowly and put a soft hand on the cool stone. "Hello, my love," he said, in a rough voice, brought on by passion. "I'm here again." Paul's thoughts went back to better times, to Rachel's warm smile and the sound of her laughing. They had been married for 40 years and loved each other and shared dreams. Paul felt lost in a world that didn't make sense without her. He took a small yellow flower out of his pocket because Rachel loved them. He put it at the base of the headstone with shaky hands. It was a bright spot of color against the dark gray. Paul said, "I miss you so much, Rachel," but it was hard to hear him. "It's so quiet here without you. Everywhere I turn, I expect to hear your words and see you." Paul's eyes filled with tears, which ran down his rough face. He didn't do anything to get rid of them. It was in this holy place that he let himself feel all of his sadness. Paul sat back on the grass and didn't care that his pants were getting wet. He started talking to Rachel, as he did every day. He told her about the little things that kept him busy, like the new puppy next door, the changing leaves on their old maple tree, and the recipe he tried but failed to follow, because cooking had always been her job. Paul's voice got louder as he talked, but the pain in his chest didn't go away. Rachel had been his rock and his compass. He felt lost without her, like he didn't know what to do or where to go. Paul broke down in tears and said, "I don't know how to do this without you, Rachel. How do I keep going when half of me is gone?" There was no answer to the question. Paul sat still and listened to the sounds of birds singing and leaves rustling. In spite of everything, life went on. That is, until Paul Smith got to this quiet part of Greenville Cemetery. He thought time had stopped. The next morning was cloudy and rainy, just like Paul said mood. Going back to Greenville Cemetery, he took the same road he had taken before. He walked with his shoulders hunched against the light rain, thinking about Rachel and the life they had shared together. When Paul got close to Rachel's grave, a sound cut through his sad mood. At first, it was hard to hear because of the rattle of raindrops on leaves. But the sound got clearer as he got closer. It was soft, sad sobs that could only be a child's. Paul looked confused, with his brow wrinkled. Kids didn't come to this part of the graveyard very often. He sped up because he was interested and worried at the same time. Paul stopped short when he came around the bend and saw Rachel's gravestone. A young black boy was huddled over his wife's grave. The kid was probably only 7 or 8 years old, because his small body was shaking with each sob. Paul was shocked to see someone at Rachel's grave, and he didn't understand why this child was there. To his surprise, he also felt a strong need to protect Rachel's final resting place. Paul said, "Hey," but his voice was rougher than he meant it to be. "What are you doing here?" The boy's head snapped up, and his scared and surprised face was full of tears. He got up quickly and moved away from the gravestone. Paul's heart hurt when he saw how upset the child was. But he couldn't get rid of the feeling that the boy was prying into something private and holy. The boy stuttered, "I'm sorry," and his voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. Paul moved closer, but he wasn't sure if he should comfort the clearly upset child or demand answers. This is where my wife is buried, he said, pointing to the stone. Why are you here? The boy's bottom lip shook as he looked back and forth between Paul and the grave. He said, Mrs. Smith, in a soft voice. She was my teacher. Paul thought the ground under his feet had moved. Rachel did work as a teacher, but she stopped many years ago. The boy in question was way too young to have been one of her peers. Paul said, That's impossible, his voice getting angrier. It's been years since Rachel taught. Please give me some alone time with my wife now. The boy quickly agreed and used the back of his hand to wipe his eyes. And then he stopped and looked back at Paul with eyes that looked way too old for his young face. He said quietly, My name is Barry. Mrs. Smith was the nicest person I've ever met. Really sorry to bother you, but please. Paul raised an eyebrow as he observed the kid in front of him. Barry's words hung in the air, sounding both impossible and true. The old man's anger started to fade, and he became more interested instead. But how? Now, Paul's voice was softer when he asked. Rachel retired years ago. Barry sniffled and used his arm to wipe his nose. He said, She volunteered at my school, and his voice was barely above a whisper. She helped kids who were struggling. Paul's heart shook. Something like that sounds like something Rachel would do. Her desire to help kids in need never went away, even after she retired. Mrs. Smith was different, Barry said, keeping his eyes on the ground. She actually saw me feel like I mattered. Paul could feel a lump in his throat. He got on his knees so he was eye level with the boy, even though the grass was wet and seeping through his pants. It was a soft question. What do you mean, son? Barry's bottom lip shook as he talked. I live in foster care. For most adults, it's just another kid to deal with. This is Mrs. Smith, His voice broke, and new tears came out of his eyes. Paul's anger went away totally, and a deep pain filled his chest. In its place, taking a moment to think, he reached out and put a reassuring hand on Barry's shoulder. She cared, Paul finished, for him, his voice heavy with emotion. Barry finally looked up to meet Paul's eyes and nodded. She was the only one who ever did, he said in a low voice. Paul saw Barry's pain at that very moment, pain that was the same as his own. He saw that the boy had lost more than just a teacher. He had lost the only person who had ever cared about him. I'm sorry, Paul said, and the sincerity in his words surprised him. I had no idea. Rachel, she never told me about the work she did for free. Barry was able to smile in a sad way. She was kind to everyone all the time. They said it was a secret. Paul laughed softly, even though tears were coming to his eyes. That sounds like my Rachel, he said, with a sneer. Always helping others, even when I didn't know it. Paul felt something change inside him as he looked at Barry. His anger and rage had changed into a mix of sadness and understanding. No, this boy wasn't a stranger. He was someone else who had been touched by Rachel's kindness and was sad about her death. Paul's heart hurt as he saw Barry's little shoulders fall. The boy's eyes, which were still wet with tears, looked up at him with a mix of sadness and hope. Barry spoke very softly, barely above a whisper. Today is my birthday. Mrs. Smith always remembered. Paul felt like he had lost his wind. He looked at Barry with his mind racing over what he was seeing. He asked again and again, his voice breaking, Your birthday? Barry agreed, and a tear ran down his face. She said we'd have a party together this year. However, he couldn't finish the sentence, so his voice fell off. Paul had trouble seeing because his eyes were filled with tears. He thought about how happy he and Rachel had been on all of their birthdays together. The thought of this little boy being by himself on his big day hit him hard. Oh, Barry, Paul said, his voice heavy with sadness. He reached out and gave the boy a light squeeze on the shoulder. I'm so sorry. Barry blew his nose and wiped it with the back of his hand. Mrs. Smith always made me feel special, like I mattered. Paul's thought was full of memories of Rachel, including how kind she was and how much she loved everyone. He knew she volunteered, but he had no idea how much. She helped other people, especially this child, in front of him. Barry went on, "She baked me a cake last year," and a faint smile passed over his face. "It was chocolate, my favorite." Paul laughed softly, even though he had a lump in his throat. "Rachel's well-known chocolate cake," he said. "She always said it could cure any heartache." Paul had a strange mix of feelings as he looked at Barry. He was sad for the young boy who had lost someone so important to him, who was also grieving for Rachel. And he felt closer to Barry because they both loved Rachel. "I miss her so much," Barry whispered, and Paul could hear him. Paul stretched out and took a deep breath. He felt like he was seeing Barry for the very first time. No kid was just getting in the way of his sadness. She had cared for and promised to help this kid, who was hurting just as much as he was. "Me too, son," Paul said, in a soft voice. "Me too." As they stood there together, Paul felt something change inside him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Rachel's grave. His heart began to crack a little through the wall of sadness that had been there for so long. He felt a warmth building in its place, a link to this boy who had been so important to Rachel. Paul's shoulders started to shake as the full weight of what was going on hit him. It made him cry tears that he thought had dried up a long time ago. They ran down his tired face. He turned away from Barry to hide the fact that he had lost it, but it was too late. "Mr. Smith." There was worry in Barry's small voice. "Are you okay?" Paul wasn't able to answer. His grief, which had turned into a dull ache over the past few months, roared back to life with a fury. But this time, it had a different flavor, a deep guilt that threatened to swallow him whole. How was it possible for him not to know that Rachel was seeing Barry? He didn't know how many other lives she had touched. In his last years, he may have missed out on so much of who she really was. The thought of this made him hurt even more. "I'm sorry," Paul choked out between tears. "I had no idea. I should have known that." Barry didn't know what to do, so he stood there. He had never seen an adult cry like this before. He hesitated before putting his hand on Paul's arm and patting it. "You can do it, Mr. Smith." Mrs. Smith was very good at keeping things secret. "It was part of the magic," she said. Paul made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He said, "That sounds just like Rachel. Always thinking of others, always trying to spread joy without drawing attention to herself." He got down on his knees in front of Rachel's gravestone and put out one hand to touch the cold stone. "Oh, Rachel," he said, in a low voice. "What else didn't I know?" Barry got down next to him and knelt down. His young face was filled with worry. "Mr. Smith, she talked about you all the time. She said you were the nicest man she had ever met." They were meant to make Paul feel better, but they only made him cry more. He was so lost and sad when he realized how much he'd missed and how much he had lost. She was showing him parts of Rachel's life he had never seen before. He thought he knew everything about her. "I miss her so much," Paul said, showing how upset he was. "And now I feel like I'm losing her all over again." As a childlike act of kindness, Barry put his small arms around Paul's shaking body. He said, "It's okay to be sad," which was something Rachel had told him before. Mrs. Smith said it's okay to cry when you love someone a lot. Paul let the boy hold him and accepted the comfort that the child, who knew something about Rachel that Paul didn't, could offer. Paul was more open and vulnerable than he had been in years. He was broken and guilty in front of a stranger. Still, Barry's presence made his hurting heart feel better in some way. Paul's tears slowly stopped as they knelt together in front of Rachel's grave. He wiped his eyes and felt tired, but lighter at the same time. Seeing Barry through new eyes, he didn't see him as someone who was getting in the way of his grief, but as a link to the woman they both loved. Paul's heart was sad as he heard Barry's story. Seeing this sweet boy spend his birthday by himself at Rachel's grave broke his heart. He took a deep breath and made up his mind. "Barry," Paul said in a soft voice, "let's get lunch." "Well, it is your birthday, after all." Barry's eyes got really big in shock. "Really? Do you want to have lunch with me?" Paul said, "Yes," and a small smile formed on his face. I think Rachel would have wanted that. They ended up at a nice diner close to the graveyard. Paul saw Barry slide into the booth. The red vinyl seat made Barry's small frame look very small. It looked like the boy wasn't sure where he was because his eyes were jumping around a lot. Paul gave Barry a menu and said, "Order anything you like. It's your birthday, after all." Paul looked at Barry while they were waiting for their food. The boy's clothes were clean, but old, and the toes of his sneakers were scratched. His eyes were tired in a way that no child should be tired. "So, Barry," Paul asked slowly, "tell me a little about yourself. Where do you live?" Barry hunched his shoulders a little. "I'm in foster care," he said in a low voice, his eyes fixed on the table. "I move around a lot." Paul had a pain in his chest. He said, in a soft voice, "That must be hard." Barry said, "Yes." But he still didn't look at Paul. "I guess it's okay. There are better places than these." When their food came, Barry got a hamburger and Paul got a club sandwich. Barry slowly started to talk to Paul. He talked about parts of his life in between bites of his burger. Barry said in a low voice, "I've been in 6 different homes this year. Sometimes I can't even remember all their names." That night, he slept in a strange bed and didn't know when he'd have to pack up and leave again. Barry talked about having foster parents who saw him as a paycheck and not being seen in houses with a lot of people. Mrs. Smith was different, Barry said, showing his first sign of a smile. "You know what? She really saw me. I felt important because of her." Paul agreed, knowing all too well how Rachel could change someone's life. As Barry talked, Paul felt like he needed to protect the boy more and more. Barry's eyes showed Rachel's kindness, and the way he talked about other people, even though he was having a hard time himself, showed Rachel's sensitivity. By the time they were done eating, Paul knew he couldn't just turn Barry back on. "It broke my heart to think of this smart, sensitive child, going from home to home, and never knowing love or security." "Barry," Paul said with a heavy heart, "I want you to know how important you are. You are important. I'm also here if you ever need anything." Barry looked up at Paul, and his eyes were still wet with tears. "Really?" he asked in a whisper, his voice full of hope and doubt. Paul softly squeezed Barry's hand from across the table. "Really," he replied firmly. "I promise." The next day, Paul had to drive to Barry's foster house. He had a firm grip on the driving wheel as he drove through streets he didn't know. Barry had given him an address that went to a rundown neighborhood with old, broken-down homes. Paul stopped in front of a rundown 2-story house. The paint was coming off, and there were a lot of weeds in the small front yard. Before getting out of the car, he took a deep breath to calm down. Paul saw toys all over the porch as he walked up to the front door. Some were broken and had been left there for a long time. When he rang the doorbell, he could hear kids fighting and a TV in the background. The door finally opened after a long time. A woman stood there with her hair all over the place and a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. "Yeah?" she asked, looking at Paul with doubt. "Hello, ma'am," Paul said in a thoughtful way. "My name is Paul Smith. I saw Barry yesterday and wanted to see how he was doing." The woman didn't change how she looked. "Barry? Oh, that new kid. He's probably around here." She turned around and yelled, "Barry," into the house. "Someone is here to help you." Paul felt bad when she said she didn't care. When she finally gave in and let him in, he was shocked by how bad the house was. There was trash and dirty clothes all over the living room, making it look crowded and dirty. The air smelled like old cigarette smoke. Barry walked in from the hallway and was thrilled to see Paul. He called out, "Mr. Smith," with a smile on his face. Paul had a sore throat. Barry's happiness was very different from what he saw around him, which was painful. He said in a soft voice, "Hey there, Barry. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." While Barry took Paul to the kitchen to talk, Paul noticed that there were other kids in the house who looked just as ignored as the ones he was with. The kitchen wasn't any better than the living room. There were a lot of dirty dishes in the sink and old food on the table. They sat at a shaky table, and Paul heard Barry talk about his day. Paul was amazed by how strong the boy was, but he could tell Barry was sad. Because of the way his shoulders sagged when he thought Paul wasn't looking, Paul felt terrible about Barry and the other kids in this house. He thought about Rachel and how she would have felt if she had seen this. It was clear that Barry's foster parents didn't care about him or treat him with respect, and Paul felt a heavy sadness wash over him. Paul got down on his knees next to Barry as he got ready to leave. "Barry," he said softly, "I care about you. You call me if you ever need anything, okay?" Barry nodded, and his eyes were still wet with tears. Paul hugged him and could feel the boy's small frame shaking a little. Paul's mind was racing as he walked back to his car. He had to take Barry away from Barry. His love for this boy and his desire to protect and love him was so strong that it was overwhelming. Paul thought that this could be his chance to get better and help someone, just like Rachel would have wished. Paul was lost as he drove home. He couldn't stop thinking about Barry and the terrible things he had seen. As he pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a moment, thinking about Barry's happy face when he got to the foster home. Paul sat down in his favorite couch, the one Rachel had always loved, inside his house. He shut his eyes and thought of her sweet smile. "Oh, Rachel," he said, in a choked whisper, "what would you do?" He thought he could hear her voice, which was kind and wise, and told him to follow his heart. Paul looked at a picture of Rachel in a frame on the side table. Her eyes looked like they were twinkling, as if to cheer him on. Paul's mind kept going back to Barry. Even though the boy had been neglected so much, he was very strong. But Paul knew that all children needed love and safety to really grow. Barry had a big smile on his face when he saw Paul at the door, and the boy had clung to him as they said goodbye. It made Paul feel a lot of different things. He realized that helping Barry had given him a sense of meaning that he hadn't had since Rachel died. He felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. But Paul started to have doubts as he thought about how big what he was thinking about was. At his age, could he give Barry the care and help he needed? Was he ready to risk the pain of loss and open his heart again? Paul got up and went to the window to look out at the garden that Rachel had taken such good care of. He thought about how hard she worked for her students and how kind she was all the time. To help a kid like Barry, she would have done anything. "Can I do this, Rachel?" Paul did not say much. "Can I continue your legacy?" Paul felt calm come over him as he stood there. He knew that giving Barry his help would be a big duty that would completely change his life. He knew it was the right thing to do, though. Paul took a big breath and felt a mix of hope and doubt. He didn't know everything, but one thing was for sure. He couldn't give up on Barry. He was going to face the problems that came up, just like Rachel would have. Paul decided what to do with a firm nod. He would get more involved in Barry's life and give the boy the love and security he so badly needed. Paul was ready to try, even though it would be hard. Paul started to see Barry more often, and each time made his heart warmer. Twice a week, he would pick Barry up from school and see the joy on his face as he got close. Those times gave Paul a sense of being alive again, like he had a reason for being sad. "How was school today, Barry?" Paul would ask, and his voice would be soft and interested. Barry would be excited and jump for joy. "We learned about fractions, Mr. Paul, and I got a gold star on my spelling test." Paul's pride would make his chest grow. "That's great, Barry. You're really being good." In the afternoons, they would go to the park or the library, where Paul would help Barry with his studies. He was amazed at how smart and determined the boy was to learn. Paul said one day, his eyes misty, "You make me think of Rachel. She loved learning too." Barry looked up from his math book, and his eyes were bright. "Really? Do you think she'd be happy with me?" Paul's throat got tight with feeling. "Oh, Barry, she'd be so very proud of you." As the weeks went by, their friendship grew stronger. Paul was excited about the time they would spend together and was planning fun activities and treats for Barry. He would bring Barry his favorite snacks or a book he thought Barry would like. Barry leaned against Paul's side as they ate ice cream cones on a park bench one afternoon. He said, in a soft voice, "I wish every day could be like this." Paul's heart hurt with a mix of sadness and happiness. He took a deep breath and put his arm around Barry's shoulders. But there was a fear that wouldn't go away in the back of his mind. Paul wasn't sure how long he could keep up these trips to Barry, because his foster situation was still unstable. He saw how Barry was neglected in his foster home and how his caretakers didn't care about him. Paul felt terrible leaving Barry there after their adventures, because he knew the kid deserved so much more. Paul had a lot on his mind as he drove home one night. He felt very responsible for Barry and loved him in a way that he hadn't thought he would feel again after Rachel died. But he was only a friend and teacher. He couldn't give Barry the security he really needed. For how long could he stay in this role? Paul's heart was heavy with worry as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. At his age, was it even possible for him to do more for Barry? The question kept him up at night, along with the happiness he felt being with Barry. Paul was very worried as he spent more time with Barry and picked up on little things that made him feel bad. It seemed like the boy was always on the lookout for something bad to happen, because his eyes would jump around a lot. When Paul reached out to pat Barry on the shoulder, the child would flinch just a little before letting go of Paul's touch. Barry's shoulders sagged as they sat on a park bench in the sun and fed ducks. He said, "Mr. Paul," in a voice that was almost a whisper, "I learned that my foster parents were talking last night. They told me I might have to move again soon." Paul's heart shook. He put his arm around Barry and felt the boy shake a little. He said, "Oh, Barry," in a soft voice, trying to find the right words. "I'm sorry that's making you crazy. It has to be really scary." Barry said yes, and tears started to form in his eyes. "I do not wish to visit a new place. I like being here with you. Only you care about me." Paul could feel a lump in his throat. He pulled Barry closer and wished he could protect the boy from all the bad things that were happening in his life. "Barry, I really care about you. That is something I want you to always remember." Paul promised Barry some fun things to do, so he started planning small trips for the two of them. He took Barry to the zoo and was amazed at how excited Barry was about the elephants. When they went to the local ice cream shop, Barry's face lit up as he picked out his choices. Paul caught glimpses of Barry as the happy child he should have been at these times. The boy's laugh was like music, and his smile was as bright as the sun. Real life would soon return, though, and Barry's happiness would fade as Paul drove him back to his foster home. Every day that went by, Paul worried more and more about Barry. He saw that the boy's clothes were often too small or worn out. Paul's heart broke every time Barry talked about his adoptive parents. He did so in a cold way that hurt Paul. When Barry looked up from his work one night while Paul helped him, he was sad. "Mr. Paul, do you think anyone will ever want to keep me for good?" Paul's chest got tight. He put the pencil down and turned his full attention on Barry. "Wow, Barry, you're such a great young man. You're brave, smart, and kind. You are a wonderful family member who would be honored to have you." Barry's lip twitched. "Then why doesn't anyone want me?" Paul gave Barry a big hug and could feel Barry's tears on his shirt. He tightened his grip on Barry and wished he could do or be more for this child who had already been hurt so much. Paul's mind was racing as he tried to calm Barry. He knew that these times of care and comfort weren't enough. Barry needed a stable place to live where he could feel loved and safe. But Paul was old, and his sadness was still fresh. How could he do that? Was he able to give Barry the home he needed? Paul kept being a steady presence in Barry's life, but the question kept bothering him. He knew that without a permanent answer, they might not have much time together. Paul was sitting at his kitchen table with a stack of papers and handouts all around him. His reading glasses were right on the edge of his nose. He spent hours reading files about adoption and foster care rules. The more he read, the more confused he became. He asked himself, "Am I crazy for even thinking about this?" As he ran his hand through his gray hair that was starting to fall out, Paul looked at a picture of Rachel that was on the counter. He felt better when she smiled at him. It reminded him of how much she loved and helped people in need. But doubt started to creep in. People told him he was too old and set in his ways to take on such a huge job. Paul sighed deeply as he picked up the phone and called his friend Frank. "Hey, Paul, what's on your mind?" The line was broken and Frank's voice came through. Paul paused before he spoke. "Frank, I need your help. It's about Barry." Frank listened carefully as Paul talked about what was going on and shared his worries and hopes. There was a long pause when Paul was done. "Paul," Frank said in a soft voice, "I know you care about the boy, but parenting a kid our age, it's not simple. Have you given that much thought?" Paul slouched his shoulders down. "I know it sounds crazy, Frank, but I can't shake the feeling that I need to do something." Frank's voice got softer. "I get it, buddy. But give it some thought. Barry is young. His needs may be greater than your own. What will happen when he is a teenager? That's not the same thing at all." Paul said yes, but Frank couldn't see him. His friend's words made him think about his own worries again. "And kids cost a lot of money," Frank said. "Next. Are you all set for that?" Paul took a quick look at the stack of papers on his desk. Budget figures were written in the margins of some of them. He said, "I've been crunching the numbers. It would be tight, but I think I could manage." "Paul," Frank said in a serious voice, "I know you want to help Barry, but you should think about whether this is really the best thing for both of you. This is a very big duty." Paul sat in silence after the call, because Frank's words were still fresh in his mind. He looked around his quiet home and tried to picture it, full of the sounds of a boy. Could he really do that? He asked himself if he had the strength, the patience, and the money to give Barry the home he deserved. Paul's heart hurt from not knowing what to do. It broke his heart not being able to help Barry and give him the love and security he needed. But did they want enough? Could he really give a growing boy everything he needed? Paul was torn between wanting to help and being afraid of taking on too much. As the night went on, he was worn out and unsure after the internal struggle, wondering if he was the right person to take on such a big part in Barry's life. Paul and Barry sat on a park bench one cool afternoon and enjoyed the sun. Paul was so happy as he watched Barry lick an ice cream cone. Paul felt good seeing the kid happy, even if it was only for a short time. "Thank you, Mr. Paul," Barry said, in a soft voice. "This is the best day ever." Paul smiled and gave Barry a soft pat on the shoulder. "Thank you, son. That's great that you're having fun." Paul saw Barry's foster parents coming up as they finished their ice cream. He felt sad because he knew that their time together was ending. Barry's smile went away when he saw them too. "Time to go, Barry," the foster mother said, in a dull voice. Paul and Barry got up and walked over to the couple. As they got closer, Paul heard the foster parents having a fight that made his blood run cold. "I can't wait to get rid of this kid," the foster dad said, mumbling. "He's nothing but a burden." "I know," his wife said. "Well, at least we get paid every month. It doesn't matter what else." Paul got very angry all of a sudden. He looked down at Barry, who was walking with his head bowed because he was used to being treated that way. Paul made a promise to himself in his mind at that moment. No matter what it took or how hard it was, He would do anything to help Barry. He was going to find a way to love and care for this boy. Paul's jaw was set in determination as he saw Barry leave with his careless foster parents. Paul told himself, "I won't let you down, Barry. I promise." Paul woke up the next morning in a small, crowded room at the neighborhood Department of Child Services. As he waited for the social worker to show up, he shook his hands tensely in his lap. Paul couldn't help but feel sad when he looked at the pictures on the walls that talked about keeping kids safe and keeping the family together. Finally, a woman in her mid-40s, who looked tired, walked into the room. She put out her hand and asked, "Mr. Smith, I'm Sarah Santos, Barry's social worker." When Paul got up, he gave her a hard handshake. "Mrs. Santos, thanks for meeting with me. I wanted to talk about Barry's case." Sarah let out a sigh and sat down in her chair. "I've heard that you and Barry have become close lately. What do you want to know?" Paul leaned forward, and worry filled his eyes. "Barry's foster home shows me how they treat him. It's not right. Isn't there something that can be done?" Sarah's face became softer. "Barry's position isn't unique, Mr. Smith. I wish I could tell you otherwise. Our system is too busy. There aren't enough good homes for all of our children." Paul's heart sank. "But there must be something we can do," she said. "Barry should get better." Sarah said yes, and her eyes were tired, but kind. "I agree, but it has been hard to find Barry a stable home. A lot of families don't want to adopt older kids." As they talked some more, Sarah's eyes suddenly grew big in recognition. "Wait, Smith, are you married to Rachel Smith?" Paul gave a surprised nod. "Yes, I am. Knew Rachel?" Sarah's face lit up. "Oh, Mr. Smith, your wife was so nice. She worked on Barry's case a lot before she died. She worked hard all the time to help him." Paul just sat there in shock and silence, his mind spinning from what he had just heard. His ears kept hearing what the social worker said. Rachel was in the process of giving Barry to her family. Even in her last days, his beloved wife worked hard to find a home for this little boy who was alone. Paul stuttered, "Boy, I had no idea." His voice was barely above a whisper. He felt a new wave of sadness come over him, along with Rachel's selflessness. That's how Sarah, the social worker, looked at him. "I thought your wife was truly amazing, Mr. Smith. Barry was very interesting to her, and she wanted to give him a chance at a better life." Paul had tears in his eyes. He thought about Barry and how close the kid was to having a real family. The knowledge of this put a lot of weight on his shoulders. Paul said, "She never told me, but he wasn't really talking to Sarah. Why didn't she tell me?" Sarah leaned in, and her voice was soft. "When people know they are going to die soon, they sometimes try to keep their loved ones from having to worry too much. Rachel may not have wanted you to go through the stress of a big life change while she was sick." Paul slowly nodded as he realized what he was saying. Rachel always thought about other people, even when she was having a hard time herself. He missed her more than ever and felt a mix of love and pain. While Paul was still shocked at first, he felt something else stirring inside him, a calling to meet Rachel's last wish. He raised his head and looked at Sarah with glassy eyes. What would it take to carry on what Rachel started?" he asked, his voice shaking but determined. Sarah raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Are you saying you want to pursue adopting Barry?" Paul took a deep breath. "I'm saying I want to look into the possibility. Rachel thought that boy had something important to offer that was worth fighting for. I should try, for her and Barry's sake." Paul felt a warmth spread through his chest as he spoke these words. He felt like Rachel was with him, leading him and telling him to let his heart open. He realized this wasn't just to make Rachel happy. It was also to give Barry the love and security he needed, and maybe find a new purpose in life along the way. Paul's heavy footsteps rang through the empty house as he went back home. What he had just learned was making his mind spin. He sat down in his favorite rocker, which Rachel had reupholstered with love years before. and took a long, shaky breath. "Oh, Rachel," he said, in a shaking voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" In his mind, he closed his eyes and saw Rachel's kind face. He saw her smile, and the love in her eyes made him feel at ease. There was a soft voice telling Paul that everything would be okay. He could almost hear it. But things were not okay. Rachel was gone, and Barry was still stuck in a foster home where no one loved him. As Paul thought about the little boy, he felt terrible. He was so close to having a real family, but bad luck took it away. "What am I supposed to do now?" Paul asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. His joints hurt, so he stood up slowly and walked over to the fireplace. It was his favorite picture of Rachel, and it was in a frame. Her head was thrown back in happiness as she laughed. Paul picked up the picture frame and ran his thumb along the glass. "You are going to adopt him," Paul said softly to the picture. "You saw something in that boy, something worth fighting for." Paul felt a lot of different emotions as he looked at Rachel's happy face. He was proud of how selfless his wife was, sad about the family that could have been, and had a deep-seated feeling of not being good enough. He told her, "Not you, Rachel," his voice heavy with feeling. "I'm not sure I can do this. I'm just an old man who doesn't change. What can I do to give Barry what he wants?" Paul slowly made his way to the window and looked out at the cute little garden that Rachel had taken such good care of. He thought about Barry, and how the boy's eyes seemed a little less sad when they were together. Paul said in a low voice, "But who'll if I don't do something?" He looked at Rachel's picture again, but he didn't know how to respect her memory because of his own limitations. Paul was finally the only one who could give Barry the love and security that Rachel had hoped for. But the thought of being in charge of something so big at his age scared him. "I'm scared, Rachel," he told her, in a voice that was hard to hear. "What if I'm not enough? What if I fail you? What if I let Barry down?" Paul stood there as the afternoon light went out, struggling with his sadness and doubt. He was torn between the safe and familiar path of his life by himself, and the new and difficult path of becoming a dad to a young boy who needed him. Paul spent the next few days thinking deeply. Barry and Rachel's unfulfilled dream kept coming back to his mind. He walked back and forth across the floors of his simple home, stopping every so often to look at pictures of Rachel and try to figure out what her frozen smile meant. Paul finally woke up one morning with a clear head. He understood what he needed to do. It wouldn't be easy, but he could feel Rachel pushing him forward. "I'll do it, Rachel," he told her picture in a soft voice. "I'm going to try to bring Barry home." Paul picked up the phone and called the social worker, but his hands were shaking. His voice shook as he talked about his choice, but it got stronger as he went on. Paul said in a firm voice, "I want to apply for guardianship of Barry. Can you help me with the process?" The social worker seemed surprised and happy at the same time. She told Paul what he needed to do and warned him about the problems he might have because of his age and lack of money. Paul paid close attention and took notes on a pad. The social worker told Mr. Smith, "It won't be easy. Are you sure about this?" Paul took a deep breath. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. Paul worked hard on the guardianship filing process over the next few weeks. He got papers together, filled out forms, and even began getting his spare room ready for Barry. He felt a mix of hope and worry with each step. Paul felt swamped by the amount of work he had to do. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers, fear crept in, telling him he was too old and set in his ways to take on such a big job. "Oh, Rachel," he sighed, and rubbed his eyes. "Am I doing the right thing?" At that very moment, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds outside and lit up Rachel's favorite vase on the windowsill. Paul smiled because he thought Rachel was trying to cheer him up. Paul picked up his pen and continued to fill out the forms with more purpose. He remembered Barry's shy smile and how his eyes would light up when they were together. Paul was sure that this process would be worth it for Barry, no matter how hard it was. Paul finally had everything ready after what seemed like an endless amount of papers and phone calls. He drove to the social services office to turn in his guardianship application. He was worried and excited at the same time. Paul's heart was beating fast as he gave over the thick bundle of papers. The clerk saw that he was nervous and smiled at him. "Good luck, Mr. Smith," she told him gladly. "We'll be in touch soon." Paul couldn't say anything because of the lump in his throat, but he nodded. As he got ready to leave, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and worry. And even though he had taken the first step, the road ahead was still long and scary. As the days turned into weeks, Paul had to find his way through a maze of red tape and doubt. After he sent in his application for care, he had to go through a long and difficult process of interviews, home visits, and questions that never ended. There was a very bad day when Paul was sitting next to a strict social worker who looked at him through her glasses. She began, "Mr. Smith," but her voice was tense with doubt. "I have to ask, at your age, do you really think you can keep up with an active 8-year-old boy?" Paul's heart sank. Even though he knew this question was coming, it still hurt. "I may be older," he said, his voice calm even though he was scared. "But I have love to give. Doesn't Barry need that the most?" The social worker's face got a little less serious, but her worries stayed the same. "Mr. Smith, love is important, but raising a child takes work, patience, and money. Are you all set for that?" Paul nodded, but his hands were shaking, which he tried to hide. "Yes, I am. I believe it will be hard, but I'm ready to do anything for Barry." Paul felt like the whole world was upon him as he left the office that day. He knew the path ahead would be hard, but he didn't expect to face so much opposition. Even his friends, who meant well, made him doubt himself even more. He met up with an old friend for coffee one morning. Bill spoke up about his worries. "Paul, buddy, I know you mean well, but have you given this much thought?" asked Bill in a soft voice. "Taking care of a child all the time is a job. Are you sure you want to do it?" Paul had a brief moment of anger that was quickly replaced by doubt. He said in a soft voice, "I have to try, Bill. For Barry, for Rachel." Paul found himself lying awake at night, his mind racing with fears. As the problems got worse, what if they were right? What if he was too old? He might not be able to give Barry everything he needs. It was hard for him to stay determined because of his worries. Paul tried not to be down, but every problem seemed like a huge mountain to climb. He knew he couldn't give up when he saw Barry's happy face and Rachel's unmet wish. That being said, Paul was getting tired and unsure because of all the stress. Paul's dreams started to fade as the guardianship process went on for too long. He had no idea that it would be so hard to take care of a child. But just when he thought things were getting tough, they did. Paul got a call from his lawyer one cool fall morning. It was like getting hit in the gut by the news. The lawyer said, "I'm sorry, Paul," and his voice was heavy with sorrow. "Barry's foster parents have filed a petition to block your guardianship application." Paul sat down in his couch with his shaking phone in his hand. "But why?" he asked, with a voice that was almost a whisper. The lawyer let out a sigh. "They say Barry would be better off staying with them. They say that moving him would cause too much trouble." Paul felt sick to his stomach. He knew the real reason. The foster parents didn't want to stop getting money to help pay for Barry. Paul was furious at the thought of Barry being treated like a paycheck. "What can we do?" Paul tried to hide his panic in his voice as he asked. The lawyer told him, "Of course, we'll fight it. But I won't lie to you, Paul, this complicates things." Paul felt more alone than ever after the call ended. He sat there in silence. He remembered Barry and the hope that was in the boy's eyes when they were together. Going to lose him now, after being so close, was almost too much to handle. Paul's fears were taking over his mind. What would happen if the court agreed with the foster parents? What if everything he did didn't work? Even though the odds had always seemed long, they now seemed impossible to beat. Paul tossed and turned that night because he couldn't sleep. He thought about Barry being stuck in that lonely house, his hopes of having a real family fading. Paul got teary-eyed at the thought. He said, "Oh, Rachel," in a low voice. "What would you do?" Paul got out of bed as dawn broke. He felt older and more tired than ever. He limped into the kitchen, brewed some coffee, and then sat down at the table to look out the window. The weather outside was dark and dreary, just like Paul's mood. He was worn out and scared about the fight that was coming. Paul thought about whether he was strong enough to finish this trip for the first time since he began it. He was deep in thought when he looked up and saw a framed picture of Rachel. She looked right at him with those soft, loving eyes. That made him remember how he felt about her all those years ago. Paul drew a deep breath and felt a small spark of hope come back to him. He knew what Rachel would say. He shouldn't give up on Barry, she would tell him if she were here. Paul picked up the phone with shaking hands. He needed to call his lawyer again. Paul knew he had to try, even if it was hard, for Barry, Rachel, and the family. As the court case went on, they could all be together. Paul's health started to get worse. Having to fight for Barry's care was too much for the older widower to handle. His hands were shaking as he read through court papers late at night. They used to be very steady. He got dark rings under his eyes, which showed that he had been worried all night and couldn't sleep. Barry, who was wise beyond his years, couldn't help but notice that Paul had changed. He saw the man who had become like a grandfather to him going away right in front of his eyes. Every day that went by, Paul's shoulders sagged more, and his warm smile showed up less often. Barry saw Paul have a hard time pouring a glass of water one afternoon. While they were sitting at Paul's kitchen table, Paul's grip on the pitcher made it shake, and drops of water fell onto the old tablecloth. "Here, let me help," Barry said softly, as he reached for the pitcher. Paul's face turned red with shame. He insisted, "I've got it, son," but his voice didn't sound as sure of itself as normal. Barry's heart hurt. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was to blame for Paul's health getting worse. The boy felt very bad about what he did. Because of him, Paul would not be facing this battle. He wasn't going to stay up late thinking about court dates and fees. Barry started to pull away as the days went by. During the time they spent together, he talked less. Instead of his normal chatter, there were long silences. Barry gave Paul short, vague answers when he asked about school or his day. It made Paul feel useless when he saw that Barry's behavior had changed. He meant to tell the boy that everything would be okay, but he couldn't find the right words. He couldn't have promised something if he wasn't sure about it himself. It felt like there was more silence between them. One night, as they sat on Paul's porch swing, Barry looked away from Paul's eyes and at his shoes. Paul asked Barry in a soft voice, "Is everything okay?" Barry nodded without looking up, but Paul could see that the boy's bottom lip was shaking. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Paul pushed and put his hand on Barry's shoulder. Barry jerked away from his touch, which surprised him. When the boy finally looked up at Paul, his eyes were filled with tears. "Maybe," Barry said in a broken voice, "it would be better if I just went back to the foster home. There would be less stress for you." Paul thought his heart might break. At that point, he saw how much his own worry had hurt Barry. His fight to protect the child now made him feel like a burden. "Oh, Barry," Paul said, with tears in his eyes, "you're not a worry to me. It's been great having you in my life." He got lost in thought and thought of Rachel. Why did he let things get so bad that Barry thought he would be better off without him? Paul was sitting on his porch and felt like the whole world was pressing down on him. Barry's court case for guardianship seemed to be going nowhere, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was crazy to try to take on such a big duty at such a young age. The sound of the mailman's truck came on just as he was about to give up, hoping things would get better. Paul sighed deeply as he walked down the stairs to get his mail. He watched with wide eyes as he opened each envelope. There was a letter from social services among the bills and junk mail. Paul tore open the envelope with shaking hands. He started to cry as he read. It wasn't another failure or rejection. When I got the letter, it was full of hope. Instead, "Dear Mr. Smith," it started, "we have received an outpouring of support on your behalf regarding your petition for guardianship of Barry." Paul was shocked. The letter went on to say that many people in the community had written to back his application. People who knew Rachel from school, Barry's present teachers, and even some of Paul's neighbors had written letters praising his character and ability to care for Barry. Paul could feel a warmth going through his chest as he read the names. He didn't know how many people were pulling for him and Barry. Rachel's best friend from school, Mrs. Johnson, wrote about how kind Paul was and how Rachel had always talked about how gentle he was. Barry's math teacher, Mr. Thompson, praised Paul for working hard to help Barry with his tasks. Paul's eyes got blurry as he read letter after letter. Each one told Barry how much he loved him, how patient he was, and how determined he was to give the boy a safe home. Their words drew a picture of an old man who was full of love at heart. Paul felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. He fought with other people. Rachel had been an important part of the community, and now they were all behind him and ready to help him carry on her loving and kind memory. Paul rushed inside to call Barry with more energy. He was so excited to tell the boy he cared about this good news. Paul's heart felt better than it had in months as he called the number. Their journey was still far from over, but he now knew that a whole community was with them. The day of the court meeting was clear and bright, but Paul's stomach was upset. For the 10th time, he fixed his tie. As he walked up the courthouse steps, his worn-out hands shook a little. A small hand moved into his. Barry, who was young, looked up at him with a worried and hopeful look on his face. "It's going to be okay, right?" Barry spoke quietly. Paul put his hand on the boy's. "We're going to do our best, son." When they walked into the building, they saw a lot of familiar faces. Rachel's best friend, Mrs. Johnson, was there with some teachers. Barry's math teacher, Mr. Thompson, gave them a peaceful nod. Some of Paul's friends had even shown up to help them. Paul's heart was beating fast as they walked into the courtroom. The meeting began with the stern look from the judge, a woman with graying hair. The lawyer for Barry's foster parents talked, and Paul heard him. The lawyer said that Paul was too old and not qualified to care for a child. When Paul's turn came, he stood up slowly because his legs were sore. He shook his head and began to talk about Rachel. Paul began to speak with a shaky voice, but soon got louder. "Your Honor," he said, "my wife Rachel was the nicest person I ever knew. Of all the people she saw, the ones who needed love the most were children. Barry was one of those kids." Paul went on, his eyes filled with tears. Rachel was going to adopt Barry before she died. Now, why she cared so much, I didn't back then. Barry should have a loving, stable, and hopeful home. My age may be old, but I love him so much. The room was quiet while Paul spoke. Not even Barry's foster parents looked like they were happy. Barry had been quiet the whole time, but all of a sudden he stood up. The judge said softly, "Barry, please sit down," but Barry didn't. He instead ran up to Paul and wrapped his arms around the old man's waist. Paul was shocked and gave him another hug. "I want to stay with Paul," Barry said, in a strong, clear voice. "He is the only one who cares about me," she said. "He picks me up from school and takes me to the park. He talks about Mrs. Rachel with me. He makes me feel safe." After seeing Paul and Barry hug, the judge's serious face became less severe. There were sniffles and quiet sobs in the courtroom from their fans. The judge blew her nose, which made the whole courtroom quiet. As she fixed her glasses and looked down at the papers in front of her, everyone was looking at her. Paul's heart was racing as he held Barry close. They were both shaking with excitement. After giving all the information, careful thought, the judge began with a steady, clear voice, "I have come to a decision." Everyone in the room held their breath. Paul closed his eyes and prayed in his mind. "I hereby give care of Barry to Mr. Paul Smith," the judge said, with a small smile on her face. Paul couldn't believe what he heard for a moment. Then, as the words hit him, he started to cry. Barry's eyes were wide with shock and happiness as he looked down at him. "We did it, son," Paul said in a choked whisper. "We're going to be a family." Barry wrapped his arms around Paul's neck and put his face on Paul's shoulder. He cried out, thank you," and his little body shook with happiness and relief. There were cheers and praise all over the courtroom. When Mrs. Johnson rushed forward, she hugged both Paul and Barry tightly. "Rachel would be so proud," she said, as she wiped her own tears. Mr. Thompson gave Paul a pat on the back and smiled from ear to ear. He told them, "You two will be fine," his voice full of dread. Paul looked around the room at all the happy, teary-eyed people as the judge slammed her gavel to get things back in order. There was a feeling in his chest that he hadn't felt since Rachel died. It felt like she was with them, and her love was all around them. "Paul," Barry said, pulling on Paul's sleeve. "Does this mean I get to stay with you forever?" Paul knelt down and looked the boy straight in the eyes. "Yes, Barry. Now, you have a place to live for as long as you want." Barry's eyes lit up with happiness as he broke into a big smile. "I love you, Paul," he told the old man again, wrapping his arms around him. Paul said, "I love you too, son," and his heart was filled with happiness. At that very moment, he knew this was what Rachel would have wanted. Not only did he grant her last wish, but he also found a new reason to live. To give Barry the love and security he needed. Paul and Barry stood next to each other at the cemetery's front gate. Through the clouds, the sun shone on the rows of gravestones, giving them a warm glow. Barry held a bunch of Rachel's favorite flowers, bright yellow daisies, in his free hand. "Are you ready?" With a soft squeeze on Barry's hand, Paul asked. Barry nodded, and his eyes were wide with worry and excitement. He said, "I think so," in a voice that was barely above a whisper. As they got closer to Rachel's grave, they walked slowly down the familiar road, making noise as their feet hit the gravel. Paul could feel a lump in his throat. He hadn't been here since the court hearing, so this was his first visit with Barry as a family. Barry let go of Paul's hand and got on his knees in front of the grave. He put the flowers at the base with great care, making sure they were in the right order. Paul watched with a heart full of love and joy. Barry said, "Hi, Mrs. Smith," in a soft voice, his fingers moving over Rachel's name. "I gave you some daisies. Paul told me you liked them the most." Paul moved back to give Barry and Rachel some time to themselves. He saw the boy move his mouth and whisper things that he couldn't hear. Paul got tears in his eyes when he saw Barry's shoulders shaking away tears. After a while, Barry looked up at Paul with tears running down his face. He spoke with a shaking voice, "I told her thank you for giving me a home and loving me enough to want me." Paul got on his knees next to Barry and put his arm around himself. "She loved you very much, son, and I know she'd be so happy to see us here together." Barry leaned into Paul's hug and sniffled softly. "Do you think she can hear us?" Paul agreed, and his own tears started to fall easily. "I think she can. Let's talk to her together, shall we?" Paul took a deep breath as they both turned to face the gravestone. "Rachel, my love," he said, first, his voice heavy with feeling. "I hope you can see us now. Your goodness and love live on in this wonderful boy you brought into our lives." Barry put his strong grip on Paul's hand and reached out to grab it. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'm going to do my best to raise Barry the way you would have wanted to show him all the love and care you showed to everyone around you. We miss you," Barry said softly, "but we're taking care of each other now, just like you wanted." Paul pulled Barry close to him and felt calm. For some reason, he felt Rachel's presence stronger than ever before. Her love wrapped around them both, making them feel like she was right there with them. since they were talking about Rachel and how she had changed their lives. Paul understood that this visit wasn't just a way to say goodbye. Remembering Rachel and enjoying the new family she had brought together were the main goals. That moment, Paul felt a sense of peace and hope that he hadn't had in a long time. He was surrounded by Rachel's love and the hope of a future with Barry. Paul and Barry turned away from Rachel's grave with their hands clasped together. The trees swayed in the light breeze. The sun was shining through the clouds and giving the graveyard a warm glow. Paul had a happiness in his heart that he hadn't had in years. They took it slowly and walked in sync with each other. Paul looked down at Barry and was amazed at how much his life had changed since the day he found him crying at Rachel's grave. Something that began as a chance meeting turned into a friendship that Paul could never have imagined. "You okay, son?" With a soft squeeze on Barry's hand, Paul asked. Barry looked up at him with eyes that were filled with many feelings. He said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I wish Mrs. Smith could see us now." Paul nodded, but he could feel a lump in his throat. "Barry, I think she can. I really do." A short time after they got to the cemetery gates, Paul stopped and looked back at the peaceful area where Rachel was lying down. He remembered how lonely it had been for him to walk these roads when he was sad and had lost someone. He felt like he had a purpose again after being without one for a long time. Barry was by his side. "I used to think my life was over when Rachel died," Paul said, with tears in his eyes. "But meeting you, Barry, it's like I've been given a second chance." Barry put more pressure on Paul's hand. He said in a soft voice, "I'm glad we found each other." Before they left the graveyard and hit the sidewalk, Paul felt a deep peace wash over him. He knew things wouldn't always go smoothly on the way. No doubt that raising a young boy at that age would be hard. But he was also sure that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Paul looked down at Barry and saw that the boy's eyes showed Rachel's kindness. It dawned on him that Rachel's love would live on through their friendship. He showed Barry respect, care, and support all the time. It was a continuation of the love Rachel had given to everyone. Paul felt better with every step they took away from the graveyard. They could see a bright future ahead of them, full of new opportunities and chances. He was sure that they would face everything together as a family, no matter where the journey took them. If you liked the story about Paul, Rachel, and Barry, I chose this one to make you feel something. Do not miss this one. To see it, check out my channel.